Hey there everyone, it is I, d&Ddoge. And today, I have a few Dungeons & Dragons horror stories that kind of reinforces the old saying, you can't fix stupid. But before we get into that, I think we need a dose of Lucky, the like and comment kitty, to bless us so we can better defend against the psychic damage we are all undoubtedly about to receive. Thanks, Lucky. You are great at what you do. But with that done, let's get right into these stories. Problem player turns against the party mid-boss fight. Turns pretty hilarious. By Reddit user Head Organization 257. Alright, meeting the cast. The DM, awesome dude, hell of a storyteller, though maybe a bit of a pushover at times. He just wants to make sure his players are having a good time. My brother and I, the only players in the group with some real experience. Both of us had played in the DM's previous campaign, which was pretty great. I'm playing a human illusion wizard, and he's a barbarian dwarf. Rogue, him, and druid, her, are an in real life couple. New players who are enjoying the game and are pretty cool. And sorceress. Finally, the problem player. Where do I start? This girl has all of the bad player tropes. Always late, speaks over other players and the DM, backstory full of sexual abuse, refuses to learn any of her abilities, and then throws fits when she does badly in combat. Is a generally annoying weeb who tries to switch the tone to anime silliness constantly. And she has the worst case of main character syndrome I have ever seen. She takes every second the campaign is not specifically about her character as a personal insult and always makes sure to pay them back. Anytime her character isn't involved in any roleplay, she's either on her phone or speaking over other people, and does anything in her power to turn every evening into a one-on-one session between her and the DM. And the rogue and druid couple are totally enabling her. We were spending near half of each session watching and cringing as the two of them would go and practically beg her to rejoin the party after her character throws a fit and leaves every time she wasn't the center of attention. Okay, that was a lot, I know. So here we are, at about level 6, heading into the dungeon of what was supposed to be the first major boss of the campaign, this Kingpin, which we were referring to as the Rat King. We cleared most of the dungeon and sneaked to the final room. We hear the Rat King and several of his goons inside. Now, my brother and I had played with this DM. His campaigns had a pretty light tone, but the boss fights? He enjoyed making those extremely difficult, so he wanted to get as much of an upper hand as possible. We came up with this plan. I would go into the room alone, disguised as one of the higher up goons that we had killed earlier, and tried to bait the boss alone inside a different room. We figured we could at least get a surprise round on him. So it goes. I go in, and there's the Rat King with 8 goons around him. I tell him that we've captured some woman who says that she knows him and that she has some important message for his ears alone. What follows is some of the most intense back and forth roleplay I have ever been part of. I roll on deception, and I almost had him when I messed up. I accidentally called him by his real name, which his goons never do. The DM caught on to it immediately, and the boss slashes my shoulder for half of my max HP in a single strike. I scream, and the rest of the party rushes in, and we now roll for initiative. There's the boss and his 8 guards against the 5 of us, and I was already at half health. Luckily, the room was pretty small, so the enemies were pretty close to each other. I managed to put some distance between me and them without getting hit by opportunity attacks, and then cast Hypnotic Pattern on all of them. 5 of the goons fail to save and are incapacitated for as long as I can hold concentration. A bit of metagaming. I knew the DM wasn't likely to use the remaining enemies' turns to wake up the incapacitated ones. It was just not his style. So I'm thinking, alright, that's gonna give us a real fighting chance. Barbarian and Druid are starting to land some damage. The boss cast a layer ability that fills the room with smoke, reducing visibility. And then comes the sorceress's turn. And, of course, she notices the opportunity of eliminating the pesky other players from the campaign and join the DM in that one-on-one story she's always wanted. So she makes a really bad case to the boss, saying that she wants to join him, and then proceeds to attack me. I can't remember what spell she used. I've never played a sorcerer, but it did plenty of damage, and then also shoved me against the wall, which means 2 concentration rolls. I failed the second one, and the 5 goons are now free. Oh, also, I'm at 1 HP. Right now, the entire party is looking at her like, dude, what the fuck? But nobody is saying anything. We all knew how she was like, and it would have been pointless. I'm obviously pissed, but I remain quiet and weigh my options. She also described her spell as being really shiny, so along with the smoke from the layer ability, the battlefield is just a mess right now. It's the boss's turn, and he laughs off the sorceress's case for an alliance. Like, duh. And then just turns around and leaves the room. This played out as the boss being like, "You're really good at killing each other. Doesn't look like you need my help." But I knew that it was in fact the DM not wanting to waste his well-planned boss fight on this mess of a situation, and opting to save it for later. So now, there's us against 8 goons. Still a difficult fight, and now we also had this awkward vibe of the sorceress trying to play it off like this was her plan all along. Quote, "See, I got rid of him. We're still friends, right?" And nobody was buying it. My turn comes up. Again, I'm at 1 HP, prone, and one of my teammates is an unstable psycho. But there are options. The battlefield is still a mess of smoke and spell effects, and the DM described the boss's leaving as rather discreet. It was my turn to catch on to his RP mistakes. From the prone position, I casted Disguise Self again, making myself look like the boss, crawled some distance beneath the smoke as to not emerge from the same location that I was at. Then I stand up and address the goons, maintaining the patronizing tone he had when he was laughing off the sorceress. Quote, "What are you waiting for? Kill them. Start with her." I had to roll deception. Only one of the 8 goons succeeded and was trying to convince the others that I'm not the real Rat King. In return, I casted Phantasmal Force on him and made him believe insects were coming out all of his orifices, thus making him tumble down and scream hysterically. I tell the goons that there's some spell cast by the party making him mad and proceed with attacking them. It worked. The fight was now 4v7, as I, still at 1 HP, was walking around giving orders. The party was fighting properly now. The rogue ended up stuck in a 1v1 fight with one of the goons in the corner of the room. The goon makes an attempt to disarm the rogue. He fails the contested check, and the goon throws the rogue's sword on the ground and proceeds to taunt him. The rest of the goons did in fact focus the sorceress as ordered, and without any help from the party, she was down within 2 turns. She was pissed, and I could tell that she wanted to sabotage my plan so bad, but her seeing that even the druid and rogue couple, her personal protectors and enablers, giving her the stink eye, seemed to really get to her. She knew she fucked up bad this time, so she took the hits, died, then looked at her phone for the rest of the fight. The enemies start going down one by one after that. The rogue grabs his sword from the ground, attempts to hit the goon, misses twice, and then gets disarmed again with the sword thrown on the ground. This goon is just schoolyard bullying the poor guy, not even striking the rogue, mind you, just using his turn to disarm him. The goons are really losing ground. They look at me scared and ask me to help them, and I just yell to them, "Man up, you little shits!" Eventually, all of the goons go down, except for the one fighting the rogue, of course. Rogue managed to land a couple hits, but then, you guessed it, gets disarmed again. The rest of the party gathers around the two, but the rogue, all red in the face in real life, is like, "Stay away, I got this." So what ends up happening is us cheering for the rogue from a distance, and laughing our asses off as the goon manages to disarm him, again. Rogue isn't doing anything wrong, he's just rolling like shit. I felt really bad for the guy, as he was visibly frustrated. The DM was laughing with tears in his eyes, barely managing to get himself to describe what's going on. And the best part? All of this was taking place as the sorceress was rolling death saves. The druid eventually cast Spare the Dying on her, then immediately went back to cheering for the fight. We offered to stun the goon to give the rogue advantage on strikes, but he refused, and in a couple of turns, he lands a hit and the DM finally gives him the "How do you want to do this?" Rogue just sits up from the chair and says, "Cut his fucking head off, I don't care, I'm going for a smoke." The session ended there, and it unsurprisingly ended up being the last one of the campaign. What a disaster. Well, I wouldn't call that a disaster. That fight seemed pretty entertaining, and OP used his head to turn the fight into the party's favor. Granted, what Sorceress did was really messed up, and she does sound like one of those players that is a chore to play with. But all in all, I think it turned out pretty good. It is sad to hear that the campaign ended, however. Let's move on to the next story. It's what Jester would do. A group of players that watch too much Critical Role. By Reddit user Eagle Soaring. This is a story of a short-lived campaign I ran, like last year for a friend of mine, who I will name Sasha, and her friends. They were super interested in playing a D&D game, but they had actually never played before, and I had some time at that point, so I offered to run a game for them. I worked and created this fantasy world based around a central theocratic kingdom that initially appeared to be a calming force on the continent, but in actuality were evil and were causing problems all over the land and stoking xenophobia to justify becoming a militant isolationist country. When talking to the party, they almost immediately started talking about how they love to watch Critical Role, and I was like, oh, cool, I guess. I've never been particularly interested in Critical Role. I've seen some clips on YouTube and watched an episode where they hunt some frog demon in a circus, but it never really grabbed me. Personally, I'm more of a Dimension 20 guy, but that's not important. I didn't really think anything of that. Big mistake. Almost any time any of them did anything, they would go on a 20-minute tangent about something slightly related to Critical Role. There were even a few times where they'd be like, "Oh, this is like the time in Critical Role they did this. Are you sure you didn't watch Critical Role?" No, I don't watch Critical Role. They did not invent all fantasy world storylines. There were even a few instances where players would go to do something and be like, "Okay, so did you watch that episode of Critical Role where they did this?" I'd respond with, "No," and they'd go, "Lame." And once, one of the players even went, "God, this is annoying. You really should watch Critical Role. We're trying to have fun here." Apparently, my not watching Critical Role is inhibiting their fun, somehow. Sasha was the worst offender of this during character creation. Sasha began with, "Okay, so do you know the character Jester from Critical Role?" I responded with, kinda. Sasha then goes into detail about how she really liked Jester's personality, and that she thinks the voice Laura Bailey does is really funny, and essentially, Sasha's character is just Jester to a T. Literally, even down to being a tiefling that is half genasi. The only difference was that Sasha's character was half fire genasi. I mostly just brushed it off, because, in my experience, new players often would rely on existing characters to base their first characters off of. This was a mistake. Sasha would always talk in a poor recreation of Jester's voice, but unfortunately, Sasha is not a professional voice actress, so it was not a particularly good performance, and just sounded like a really bad Russian accent. If that was it, I wouldn't have had an issue. I suck at voices too. Almost everything she did or said had the tagline of, "This is what Jester would do, so this is what I do." She mostly used this to justify acting as an airheaded, flighty character that was just the definition of chaotic random. Now, I'm not super familiar with the characters in the Critical Role campaign, so someone will need to tell me if this is something Jester would do. The party was in the governor's mansion of the town they were in, and were getting a job to do something about the nightmares plaguing the town. I wrote the governor as the small, worried little man who was a touch incompetent, and when negotiating with the governor, Sasha gets annoyed that the negotiations aren't going anywhere and says that she wants to grab the jewels of the governor and twist until he gives in and gives them the pay they want. I immediately tell her no, because one of the few rules I have at my table, one that I mentioned at the beginning of our talks to run this game, is no sexual violence of any kind. Sasha rolls her eyes and says it really doesn't matter since he's a guy. I just remained firm and repeated, "of any kind," and she just goes, fine, whatever." This happened a lot. She was a very impatient role player, but also tried to turn every interaction into a personal acting performance, since it's what they do on Critical Role. It was a dichotomy that did not work. She would rebound between dragging things out into a slog when all they had to do was talk to a priest about what he thinks is causing the nightmares. It was a kind of dream eater monster, by the way, causing what should have been maybe a 5-minute conversation into a 40-minute gallivant that resulted in nothing really happening and ignoring major NPCs and information because she doesn't have the patience to talk to the court wizard for more than 7 seconds. The game fizzled out after a few sessions because I had enough of them basically trying to turn the campaign into some kind of Critical Role fan game. Much to their surprise and chagrin, not everyone watches Critical Role. TLDR, group of new players that are really into Critical Role play in a new campaign and try to make everything about Critical Role, and then get annoyed at me, the DM, because I don't watch Critical Role. And one player just wants to be Jester in every aspect. Well, yet another story of the Mercer effect rearing its head. Look, I'm a fan of Critical Role, but I realize that it's not everyone's bag. Expecting a DM to basically recreate Critical Role is not only annoying, but also kind of insulting. They are spending time working on a game for you to enjoy. Maybe show a little appreciation. Unfortunately, while Critical Role is pretty good and fun to watch, it is a lot of people's first exposure to the game, and when they try it out for the first time, they expect it to be the same quality. These players did that and then took it to the next level by basically trying to recreate a character from that show. I just hope that those players come to realize that D&D isn't Critical Role, but the other way around, and learn to just appreciate playing the game. Because if not, I fear that they will never be able to enjoy it. Though, those are just the thoughts of this rambling Doge on the internet. What do you think? Let's move on. How Not to Play with an Underage Player by Reddit user DesReploid. This happened a long while ago now, and isn't nearly as bad as some of the other stories here. I think the second time I ever played D&D. I had to look for people online to play with because none of my friends were interested in D&D, and there wasn't anywhere to play in the town I lived in. I was a 16-year-old at the time, but I was genuinely rather mature for my age. People mistook me for someone in their early 20s a few times on the interwebs when I didn't point out my age, and I never really tried to consciously act older either. I told this group about my age up front because everyone was asked for their age at the beginning. We were 6 people, most of them in their 20s. The exceptions were me and the problem. We'll call her Julia, who was in her mid to late 30s. I can't remember the exact number. Nobody seemed to have any problem with my age. Over the few months that she was in the group, she would constantly be demeaning to me. I've always liked to discuss and always took an interest in complicated topics, politics, philosophy, etc. And anytime I would talk about these things, I would, sooner or later, be interrupted by a, "Well, but you're just a child though," or something of that sort. Eventually, I and the others got comfortable enough around each other to make some dark and/or sexual jokes sometimes, and we all thought it was funny. Julia didn't think that though, and always had to remind everyone that I was only 16 years old, and that you can't be saying these things around me. If someone swore, she'd tell them not to because a child is around. I have always sworn like a sailor, so when I did it, she'd have a go at the others, saying that they were teaching me these bad words. I eventually asked her politely to stop. I was upset because her behavior felt like an insult to my intelligence. She acted as though I couldn't spend my time having proper intellectual discussions because I was 16. I told her that I never asked to be treated differently, and that, regardless of that, she wasn't treating me like a 16-year-old, but more like a 6-year-old. She said she would stop. She didn't. After this came sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. When I would act in character, she would now start to tell me, "This isn't how adults act," and try to get me to do something else. My character was very attached to a stuffed animal, as it was a parting gift from his younger sister before she had died of a disease. It eventually got damaged badly, and my character was inconsolable. Julia then insisted on telling me that this is not how an adult would act, that I'm doing it wrong, and I should rather just have my character accept the loss of that precious item and memory. Another time was when my character saw a particular candy from his homeland. He had the far traveler background, and I really liked to play off of that, and got really excited about it. He bought a stupid amount of it and paid a lot. Out of character, I knew this was a dumb decision, but it seemed funny to me, and I thought it fit my character. Cue Julia telling me an adult would never spend money that recklessly for something like that. After that session, I asked the DM to talk about it with her, since she obviously wouldn't listen to me. A few days later, she disappeared, never to be seen again, and everyone had a much better time at the table after that. TLDR, older player thinks they can decide what my character does and doesn't do, because I was 16 years old at the time. Was Julia ever a teenager? Because I don't know about all of you, but when I was 16, the people my age would say some of the raunchiest and immature jokes ever, and also cuss like sailors. Not around adults, mind you. Julia was definitely treating OP a bit too much like a child, by trying to shield him from things that would be considered tame when compared to a Call of Duty game lobby. Then she continued to treat him that way for playing his character the way that character would act. I can understand OP's frustration and feeling like she was insulting his intelligence. Though, I will admit, I also thought I knew everything when I was that age. Boy, was I wrong. I'm glad to hear that she went the way of the dodo, and OP and the others at the table continued to have a good time. Have you ever had an experience in playing D&D with a player that just did stupid things? If so, and would like this Doge to read it, feel free to post it in the comments, on the d&Ddoge subreddit, or even just at me on Twitter. As always, I appreciate all of you, and hope you don't run into anyone that made their IRL intelligence be their dump stat. Until next time.